Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to episode 9 of FootMarks, in which I, your host, Behram Qazi, will be talking to Jarrod Kimber about his work. And on the itinerary today is Jarrod's piece on Steve Smith struggling with his sleep. So, as we all, whoever's read it or whoever hasn't, should know that Steve Smith really struggles big time trying to sleep during a test match, and that's 5 days. But before we even get into that, Jarrod, there's something very funny that you mentioned at the start of your piece, is that Steve Smith, ironically, has stake in a mattress company, and it's been quite fruitful for him. He turned a $100,000 investment into $12.1 million, which is insane. I mean, he probably made more money off of that investment that he would have made through many franchise leagues, barring the IPL maybe. So the irony
I think
really,
he would have made more. I think that's more than what he's ever made off the IPL. We'd have to go back and check, right? But my guess is that, I mean, it would be Australian dollars. So it's probably closer to 7 or 8 million would be my guess. But yeah, it's ridiculous. For those, I don't know if they're big in Asia. You probably would have had them when you were in Canada, which is, it was, the mattress industry was like really old fashioned, right? You had to go down to the local store and talk to the guy. And then people worked out that you could roll the mattresses up and send them out to people. And people started doing more experimental mattresses, and they would give you, and so there's heaps of them. And so he invested in one of the Australian models of that, and clearly it went absolutely ballistic. And it may even not even be Australian. It might have gone international now as well, but I'm pretty sure it's an Australian one. And yeah, it's all the more funny because you're talking about a guy who can't sleep during test matches. And one of the reasons that I'd never really written about this, and there's almost like a second spin-off article that I could put off it, is I never slept the night before cricket games. And so I know exactly what is happening. And from that perspective, there was nothing I could ever do. And I remember we had a very strict captain at one stage who was like, everyone needs to be in bed by 11 o'clock. And I had to go to him and I was like, look, and this is before social media, so he never would have caught me, but just in case I happened to be out and someone he knew was there, I said, look, I will not be asleep before 11 o'clock. If I'm in bed at 11 o'clock, I'll still be awake at 3 a.m. What I do is I don't sleep the night before, but I also don't get hammered as much on a Friday night as I do on a Saturday night. And I'll go to bed very late. And the reason was, if I went to bed at any normal time, I would spend 2 or 3 hours going through every single thing that could happen in the game the next day. And I would assume that's what happens with Steve Smith. And then I only played in a few multi-day games, as in, played on a Saturday and a Sunday, or we also played on 3-day games and sometimes 4-day games. They were much worse for me for the same reason, is now you know what's happened on the first day. So now in the second day, you literally know the bowler's face, you know how the ball's going to come out, you know where you're going to put the field if you're the captain, all this sort of stuff. So for me, it was, it makes a lot of sense that Smith is like that. I was actually surprised that more players aren't like that. And so from that perspective, I wonder if, me and Steve Smith both don't have the same kind of obsessive personality that sort of means that that's all we can do, right? Once we do that. It took me years to fix. It wasn't just cricket that I had trouble with. I had trouble with my sleep everywhere. And if it wasn't cricket, it was something else. And I basically spent about a decade training myself in how to go to sleep. And so I know how tough it is. And I've tried the sleeping pills and everything else as well. And so I can understand why he doesn't want to use those, and neither would I. It was. I just thought it was a really fascinating story, and then I was like, "Well, okay, now is it true?"
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe. Here's a theory that the reason why Steve Smith can't sleep during a test match is because he's gotten so used to his own mattresses that he's selling that that's all he can sleep on. So maybe that's a theory. Maybe you should look into getting one of those mattresses, Jarrod. But your approximations in the piece, and of course this is only going by what Smith has said himself, is that he gets approximately 12 to 14 hours of sleep throughout a test match, which by no means can be enough, particularly when you're playing red ball cricket and multi-day cricket and the rigors of it all and being switched on all the time. And like you mentioned, there's new drama every day, overnight drama. So just to cope with that mentally as well.
3 things I never trust. No, I agree.
That can't be healthy playing a professional sport.
No, I agree. But there are 3 things that I never trust, right? When it comes to, especially men, it's obviously their dick size, right? Then it's how many drinks they had the last night. And then it's how many hours of sleep they had. Women are the same, of course, because it's actually very hard to know how much sleep you've had, right? Yeah. And for those of you who do struggle with sleep, the best way, of course, is to just lay in the one position. It's the tossing and turning, which is the bigger issue. Even if you're not sleeping, if you lay in one position, you're still rested enough for the next day. Whereas most people, when they're not sleeping, they toss and turn more. They wake up, they maybe have a snack, they do all these different things. So we're going on how many hours he is telling us that he's sleeping. My guess is it's probably slightly more than that, because you're never quite sure when you're awake and when you're asleep anyway, right? Like, there are some times when you know when you're in REM sleep, but quite often we don't know. But yeah, so we went with that. And as you said, there's no way that can be enough for a professional athlete, especially if it's different if you're a sprinter and you don't have a lot of sleep the night before a race. But then you've got the next day you're not sprinting, and so you have sleep again, and then the next day you don't have sleep. It's the repetitive nature of it. I don't think one night of having 3 or 4 hours sleep, I don't know how and everyone's different. You don't seem to have any sleep, so you don't you shouldn't even be in this conversation. But for us normal people, most of us can get by with one night of between 4 and 6 hours sleep without it really affecting our performance. But if you go 4 hours of sleep, 4 hours of sleep, 3 hours of sleep, 5 hours of sleep, it just gets worse and worse and worse, right? And I think that is where the Test cricket specifically means it doesn't work very well for Steve Smith.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I am someone who is nocturnal myself, and I don't get a lot of sleep, but I will get 5 to 6 hours a night. And let's suppose that Steve Smith, let's bump that number up to 20. Let's suppose he gets 20 hours of sleep, right? 20 divided by 5 is still 4. So during a test match, he's getting 4 hours of sleep a night. Even if that's like a higher limit, that's not enough, especially when you're out in the field for 90 overs every day, or maybe not every day, but for a lot of the game, right? Yeah. And then he bats for long periods as well. So, I mean, it can't
your body can't regenerate, right? I mean, the idea of sleep is just to rest your body. And if he's just, as I said, if he's just laying there and staring, it's probably not the worst. But if it's, my guess is, and this is what I had my problems with
the way he bats, you'd expect he'd be tossing and turning.
Yeah, be fiddling all night, right? Making sure his underwear's on correctly, changing the duvet setup. The sheet is too tucked or not tucked enough, right? He'd be retucking it. But yeah, I would assume that was how I learned about sleep, was essentially eventually it was the worrying about the sleep that was causing me the issue. Because if I went to bed at 10 o'clock at night and I knew I had to get up at 6 a.m. in the morning, if I realized it was 12 or 1, even without looking at my clock, if I realized I'd been in bed for ages and not sleep, that was when the issues would start to come. Whereas now I'm just like, well, I've been laying still for 2 or 3 hours, and then eventually I will doze off and then I'll come back. Whereas it's clearly an issue for him because he's mentioning it. So I would say that he is moving around. So his body is not regenerating. He's not resting the way that he should be, which means he's not going to be as sharp for the things he needs to be sharp for.
Yeah, let's hope he's not shuffling a lot in bed. But, I mean, going by, like, my own experiences, if I've slept, like, 3 to 4 hours, I can do my work, but I struggle. This guy's playing a test match, so, I mean, that just blows my mind. But anyway, let's get into the numbers, shall we? Steve Smith averages close to 16 test match cricket. He's considered the best after or since Bradman by many. But when you break those numbers down, it's a very interesting sort of split. By innings, of course. In the first innings, he averages a whopping 86, which is, again, the best since Bradman, with a minimum of 2,000 runs for all batters, I believe. That's what was in your piece. And then if you go gradually to each next innings, there's a drop. And there's a significant drop to the point where in the fourth innings, he averages around 28. Now, there might be a lot of reasons at play, but surely sleep could be a factor over here, or the lack of, actually.
Yeah, it's a very... Not all batters have a drop, right? So we know it is, the batting averages do drop by innings. But because of the way that you play and the conditions you play in and all these sorts of things, it's usually a bit more of a wiggly line. You might struggle on the first morning of test matches because you don't like the ball zipping around sideways. But then by the second innings, when it's a little bit flatter, that might be your really good innings. Third, you might stay really good. And then fourth, you might struggle when the ball's keeping a little bit low. Whatever that may be. Or it spins more. Whatever that lateral movement comes in, but now it's spin. And yet you look at his numbers, and it looks like a slide, right? It looks like he starts up here. I think,
linear.
What did you say? It was 86... Is it 55, 38, 40, I think, and then 28? Maybe I've got the numbers slightly wrong. But
28 and 86 are accurate, and I think 55 is as well. I forget the one in the third innings, but the rest are fine. And it's very, very linear. It's like an actual slide.
Exactly. And that was the thing that made me think, well, it must be sleep-related. And I think everyone else who's ever looked at this probably just went, oh, it's sleep. And as we'll talk about, I went a lot deeper than that. And I do think there's other issues here at play rather than just sleep. But I find it hard to see that angle and say that everything we know about Steve Smith, he shouldn't be averaging. If he can average 86 in the first innings, which quite often the ball is moving around and things are happening, and you know, it doesn't really make sense that he averages 28.
Mm-hmm.
And what I wanted to know, and we'll talk about this a lot, was, is this something that happens to other people?
Right.
And is there any way we can work out if the tiredness does play a factor? But while also admitting that it's quite clear that the kind of game he plays, he relies on consistent bounce a lot more. And in the fourth innings, you're going to get much less consistent bounce than you are in the first innings. And so that might also play an issue as well.
Yeah, we'll get into all of that good stuff. But here's an interesting one for you. If we just look at the drop from first innings to second innings, all right? 86 to 55, that's 30 runs on average, right? That's a lot. And this is for like all the batters in the world. And you look at this drop and you're like, okay, that's massive because both of these are the first innings. Like this is Australia's first innings. So him batting first, like in a test match, and then batting second, there's a drop of 30 runs. And would you say that maybe there's some correlation over here that, you know, one sleepless night versus two sleepless nights equals to 30 runs lost in his average?
No. So I think that's a really good question. What I would say is this is the point where I went, he shouldn't be dropping 30 runs from one or let's say 2 nights of sleeplessness, right? I understand the fourth innings one. The fourth innings one makes a lot more sense. For the second innings one, you're just like something else. That's when I started to talk about the context. Steve Smith is, look, I don't know what spectrum Steve Smith is on, and I don't know if he's ever been tested. I think a lot of elite athletes are on different spectrums. I've never been tested. I'm sure I'm on multiple spectrums. I think you seem normal. But, you know, some of the other guys we work with are not. A lot of sports writers are on the spectrum. Whatever spectrum that may be. Maybe ADHD or autism or, I don't know, there may be other spectrums as well.
I got a tweet just today that, are you autistic? Did not know how to respond to that.
Okay, well, the answer was... Anyway,
the answer was you're getting blocked.
And so I think from that there is an element of he is a peculiar I spend a lot of time with very good players. You know, I know a lot of other players who are near his level, of his level, you know, or not of his level, but, you know, near his level, greats for their country. He is different even amongst those sorts of people, right? In the way that Boycott was different amongst those sorts of people, in the way that KP was different amongst those sorts of people, in the way that Viv Richards. There's a lot of players who are just different. Javamine, that's probably another very good example of that. I think particularly if you look at Steve Smith, he's at his absolute best when the only thing he has to do is worry about the next ball. He doesn't have to worry about the context of the game. He doesn't have to worry about what the opposition has already made. He doesn't have to worry about getting a lead. He doesn't have to worry about the fact that they've lost 5 wickets, but they're at this. All he has to worry about in the first innings is making as many runs as possible at his pace. Right? Nothing else at that stage matters other than if he can make it to 180, Australia are at least going to be 350 to 400. They'll be in a good position of winning that game. Even from the second innings, I think things do start to change. Now, maybe it is. I mean, you said 1 day's tiredness. It might be 1.5 days, right? Because there might be some days when he's not batting, you know, until the third day or whatever those sorts of situations are. But the context of the game is already dictated to him. And if you watch him play in T20 cricket and one-day cricket, he is not as good a player as he is in Test match because he doesn't play as well to the context of those situations. In a way that someone like MS Dhoni didn't bat particularly well in Test cricket at times until he had context. He needed to know why he was batting at that time rather than just batting for as long as possible.
Ben Stokes is someone who uses context probably the best out of the lot, right?
I think so. He's another really good example of that. Whereas I think Steve Smith is maybe more of an old-fashioned, just numbers sort of person. I think it would be silly to downplay that just because we also have evidence through white ball cricket that this is an issue. And we've heard him talk. We know that, you know, when he's just focusing on the next ball and making as many runs as possible, he makes a lot of runs. When he's actually out there and he's thinking about everything else, you know, sometimes those things do bother him a little bit more and do play on it. So I would like to think that drop from first innings to second innings has something to do with that. The only other thing I would say, and I'm sure you're going to bring this up soon anyway, is that he also hasn't batted as much in the second innings as he has in the first innings. We know he has a very good sample size in the first innings. Australia has batted first an extraordinary amount of matches that Steve Smith has played in. He hasn't batted second as much. And I don't want to say it's small sample size because I don't think that would be fair because he certainly batted there a lot. But it's certainly, I trust the numbers in the first innings and the third innings more than I do the numbers in the second innings and the fourth innings just because he hasn't played in them as much.
Yeah, that's fair, and I suppose we don't need to visit that now because you've put that out pretty clearly.
Well, just before we go ahead, fourth innings, was it, he's batted 24 times in the fourth innings?
Yes, that is correct.
That's not a lot for someone who's played as many matches as him. And I was
Absolutely not.
shocked it was that low coming in. I didn't know that. And I do think that plays a part in the overall thing. Although, just to go back, it's a slide, right? It's not as if the fourth innings is bad on its own.
Absolutely. But just before we go deeper into the numbers, of course, because there are a lot of those, I just want to touch the topic of sleep doctors because you mentioned how the NBA and NHL in particularly, they started employing sleep doctors because they recognize the importance of sleep for professional athletes. And then a very recent interview of Dele Alli, a footballer in England, it revealed that, Tottenham Hotspur, the football club, used to give their players sleeping pills. And he got addicted to those sleeping pills because it helped him escape a lot of other problems going on in his life. So what's your take on all of that? Should Australia be looking at these sort of fixes? And can this help Smith or will it just be futile?
So I've never told this story before, and I've always wondered when I was going to, but here's the time. I was a shift worker, and being a shift worker is a little bit like being a cricketer who plays a lot of day-night games, or a basketballer. Don't know about football as much, but maybe footballer as well. In that it's not just about the fact that you're working in the afternoons or nights. It's also when you get home, if you get home at 3 a.m. from a shift, you can't go to bed by 3:15, right? Because everything's working. And generally, when you have problems with sleeping, it eventually comes back to sleeping pills. So I took a sleeping pill called Stilnox, which has different names everywhere, but it's the same pill that Heath Ledger used.
Okay.
Yeah. And the doctors just had given up on helping me how to sleep. So they started giving me these things. And I started having the weirdest dreams of my life. And then not long after that, I started thinking people were in the room with me at night. And it's a particular sleep. I forget the name of it. It's related to sleep paralysis.
Oh, I get that.
Yeah, but it's not sleep paralysis in that I am fully asleep, but I am acting out things, and it's not just a form of sleepwalking as well, where even though I can feel a person next to me on the bed or all these sorts of different things, and I'm conscious of it, I'm still asleep. So quite often with sleepwalking, you don't know what you're doing at all, and you suddenly wake up and you're like, how am I in this hallway? I could tell you exactly why I was in that hallway, Behram, but when I would tell you why I was in that hallway, you would look at me like I was mad, because I used to have dreams that Adolf Hitler was in my bedroom.
Okay.
Right? Sometimes it would be aliens, sometimes it would be Hitler, sometimes it would be all these things. To the point, at one stage, I was positive that Adolf Hitler was watching TV in the room next to me, and I came out of the door, and my girlfriend at the time was watching TV. And it got really bad until my flatmate was worried I was actually going to come in and hurt him because I had done stuff. In fact, I've had moments where I've tried to protect my wife from a ghost, right? This is what happens on sleeping tablets. It doesn't happen for everyone, but those are the extreme cases. So you hear the Dele Alli one, and you're just like, why would you be prescribing these to your players? Because people do have these sorts of impacts. Then you get addicted to them, as Dele Alli did, as Heath Ledger did. I think I was addicted to them for a little while. But also, it's not a normal kind of sleep. For some people, sleeping tablets just work perfectly, and they wake up rested, and they're like ready to take on the day. For a lot of us, we wake up in this weird kind of haze. And so what has happened a lot over the last couple of years is we now realize that sleep affects players and athletes far more than it ever has before. So when I started looking into this with Steve Smith, I never saw the word sleep therapist there anywhere. But I did see that he tried sleep tablets and he didn't like them and he went off them. And so I started talking to everyone in cricket, and I couldn't find anyone in cricket who'd ever hired them. Now, I know from my friends who played in the IPL, this is early on in the IPL, that their biggest problem was that you play the game at 8 o'clock at night. Some of those games don't finish till around midnight. You get back to the hotel at 1 a.m. Your beans are pumping because of the game. You're up till 2, 3, 4 in the morning, right? And then the next day you might have to travel somewhere else, or you might have practice or whatever else. And so
the Royal Challengers owner had an open bar. Maybe that was also a thing.
That did
back in the day.
That didn't particularly help either. There was a lot of that. I mean, There's a lot of stories about the IPL. But the point is, a lot of that day-night cricket does, and it completely screws you up. And then the next day, you try and go back to a normal sleep habit, but you can't go back to the normal sleep habit. So I just figured by now, cricket, with a sport that has massive amounts of travel and a lot of day-night games and different formats, right, would have this. I couldn't find anyone in cricket who had ever hired these people. I'm pretty sure that someone hired one for Steve Smith, whether it was him directly, or his agent or his manager directly, or whether it was Cricket Australia on his behalf. But it does seem like an untapped market for cricket because it's a sport there. I know so many players who have problems with their sleep habits within cricket. Not in the way that Steve Smith does, but just in the, trying to deal with the day-night games, the day games, sleeping during a test match as well. I have heard other players complain about it in different ways. And so it is an issue. And the reason I know about all this is because in basketball, they talk about it all the time. And so I'll tell you about a CPL game I worked at where I think we're in Guyana, I want to say, and we finished at 1 a.m. and our flight was at 6 a.m. Right? So the game, by the time we got back to the hotel, it was 1 a.m. and our flight was at 6 a.m. And I, as an analyst, I couldn't work out how to manage this. So I'm going to have like 3 hours of sleep. Then I'm going to get on a plane for an hour and a half. Then I'm going to get on a bus for an hour and a half. Then I'm going to be at the other place. And then the game was the following morning, right?
Yeah.
We had things like that all the time. We even had players, when I was at the CPL, we had 3 players, they couldn't get a visa via America. And so they ended up having to sleep on the floor of the Panama airport, right? It's not, cricket really has an issue with these sorts of things a lot. And so, looking at the American sports, and I think football is another one. Obviously, Tottenham were trying to, was it Tottenham you said?
Yeah, Tottenham.
Yeah, they were trying to fix it, maybe making it all a lot worse. But the point is that professional athletes, it's a bit like shift workers, but then it's shift workers with travel, which is kind of the worst kind of shift working. And then you've got the physical thing of it. When you finish that game, your beans, I'm sorry, I'm going all Gareth Batty here, but your beans are pumping, your mind, you can't turn your brain off, you've got adrenaline in your system, something's happened, Sri Lanka have lost a wicket right at the end. The captain's trying to work out what that all means. The number 8 batter's got to come in the bat the next day. All these different things happen. Sleep is a really important thing, and it isn't something that I think cricket has focused on enough.
Fair enough. You mentioned the CPL. Well, they advertise themselves as the biggest party in sport, right? So I don't know why you were expecting sleep, because sleep is for the weak.
Hey, I was up on that in Guyana, and no one was around to party. Those players went and had to sleep that night, because I thought, great, we'll stay up with them. They could play some dominoes. I'll watch some movies beside them. They all went to bed that night. It was the only night they all went to bed, of course, but yeah.
Oh, well. Now let's get back to the numbers, of course. You had lots of them, and there were these 2 really nice pie charts that you had, which had all of Steve Smith's runs and innings percentages, by each innings, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So both of those pie charts were right next to each other, and you could see that his utilization of innings number 3 and 4 with respect to the amount of runs scored with the number of innings he had or opportunities he's had, there was a big disparity over there. Now that surely does not seem right for someone who is considered the best since Bradman. That sounds like the numbers of someone who can only bat when Australia are batting in their first innings.
Yeah, I was a bit shocked at that because I knew his batting average was low coming in. I mean, I'm not the first person to cover that side of it, right? Yeah, that's been covered before. But what I was more interested in was the fact that he hadn't played a lot of 4th innings, but he'd still massively underperformed in them. Average is fine. If he had a low average, but he was still making a decent amount of runs, you go, he's missed out on a couple of not outs here. And, as I said, it wasn't a lot of innings. But when you look at it and you're just like, actually, the percentage of runs doesn't make any sense here. He's just not making any runs. At that stage, you realize that it is a proper problem, and it's not he's missed out on a couple of easy chases at the end of games. And, the fact that such a large percentage of his runs came from the first innings, considering he hadn't played in the first innings that much more than he played in the other, in the third innings. More than half
of his runs in Test cricket come in the first innings. That's ridiculous. Out of 4, the first innings.
I didn't go through everyone to work out if anyone had ever done this, but I would be shocked if there's any other major player who has that record. Because no one else has ever averaged anywhere near to him. But that is, when I saw that was the point at which I thought you could make an argument that you always bat first against Australia to take him out of the game. because you are literally saying at that point, I think he averages 86 in the first innings, and then it's 41, I think, for the last 3 innings combined, or something like that, 40 or 41.
Yeah.
I'll take 41, Steve Smith, right? I'll take that any day. So we will just bat first every time. Steve Smith's now just a normal batter, and let's see how we go in the game.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, if you're an analyst, that certainly makes sense because the sample size is, a big one because Steve Smith has played a lot of games. But, there's more than meets the eye over here, of course, because if you look at his 4th innings average, Steve Smith averages, 28? Above in the list from him is Jason Holder. Now, we all know that Steve Smith is a much better bat than Jason Holder, yet his 4th innings average is below Holder. So there are a bunch of variables. Of course, sleep cannot be the only factor, even if it is a contributing factor or variable. There's the fact that he plays across the line a lot. And also, he's a fidgety player. He also relies on consistent bounce a lot, which is pretty much, that's why the best time to bat for him is in the first innings, even more so than the second innings. So, yeah, just break it down for me. What do you think are the main things at play over here?
So we talked about the rest and we talked about the context. I think context probably not a huge amount, but plays a small role. I think the fact that he plays across the line so consistently has to factor in because we do know that the ball keeps lower at the end and that bounce is not as consistent. I don't have any great numbers that suggest that I'm 100% right here. The first thing I did was I looked at other players who are famous for playing across the line. So I had KP, Viv Richards, Victor Tromper, and Bradman. They don't share the same pattern. But it should be said that those guys play across the line from sort of outside off stump and drag the ball to the leg side. Whereas what Smith is doing is he's essentially turning his off stump into his leg stump every ball. And so the only way I could work out how to look at it was that his LBW percentage goes up. So I think he's a below average LBW in the first and the second innings, which is remarkable considering the way he plays, by the way. Couldn't believe that. And then in the third and the fourth innings, he's an above average LBW player. So it does suggest that as the pitch gets slightly less consistent, he does struggle with the LBWs and everything else. And this is kind of where I started the article from, which is everyone was so convinced it was only sleep. And I was like, but he plays across the line. Like, surely that has to factor in. And it's not, I don't know what percentage it would have had to be. But maybe if it had been like 33% of his dismissals in the fourth innings for LBW, it would have been like ding, 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 ding. And I think it's closer to 26% or 24%, somewhere around there.
1/4.
Yeah, it's about a quarter. I can't remember on what side of the quarter it is. But certainly, the big difference was, I showed it to Cheyenne, who obviously works with us. And I said to him, what do you think of this? And he said, well, he's below average LBW and then above average LBW. That in itself tells you that he is not playing the second innings in the same way he plays the first innings. And that is probably because the consistency of the bounce isn't there. So I think I don't know how we would assign percentages to all these different things to say how much they are involved, but I find it very hard to believe that a player who plays consistently across the line would be as good in the fourth innings as they are in the first innings if they play the way that Steve Smith does, where they're bringing LBW into play so much more. So I think that has to be a significant reason why he struggles more in the later innings than he does in the first one.
Fair enough. Now, let's talk about the trend again, the linear slide that Steve Smith has gradually over each test innings. And you did a bit of research over here, and quite commendable, I'd say. Because
I went the full nerd.
You definitely...
I dived into my own spectrum.
But yeah, so I of course want you to elaborate on that, but just to give readers a bit of context, Jarrod looked at wicket keepers and their slide because they're the one who do the most exertion, right? They're keeping wicket all game. And then he also looked at like wicket keepers who bat in the top 6 and wicket keepers who are specialist keepers and you don't expect them to bat. And the ones who are batting in the top 6, there's a bit more of a slide over there, but they're not comparable slides to Steve Smith, which is fascinating. And then you also looked at the Fab 5, you included Babar as well in that, and all of those guys, Root, Williamson, Virat Kohli, Babar Azam, their patterns and trends were not linear like Steve Smith. They had like crests and troughs. It was like all wavy for them. Yeah. But then, after doing enough research, you found a fair few cricketers, many of them Australian, and Everton Weekes and Azhar Ali and Brian Lara, all of these names, who actually had these similar trends for innings per runs breakdown as Steve Smith. So go ahead, the floor is yours. Elaborate on your findings and blow our minds.
So my first question was, if we're so sure it's sleep, then there shouldn't should there not be there should be very few other players who have this trend, right? If we're short sleep. And I sort of started by looking for players who were quite good in the first innings, and then started looking at how they were in the fourth innings. And that's how I found Everton Weekes. And, Brian Lara was another one who I think he might have been a similar player. And Azhar Ali was another one who was very good over the first couple of innings and then struggled at the end. So there was a few players there, and they're all a little bit different. Although Brian Lara and Everton Weekes are quite similar in the way they sort of tail off like Smith. It's not quite as dramatic as him, but that's because no one's ever averaged 86 in the first innings and then 55 in the second. So no one actually looks like him. But the general drift downwards is certainly something I saw a lot. And I wouldn't have expected Brian Lara to be there because he's famous for being a great player of spin, right? So it's an interesting thing to see him at the end. Then I sort of thought to myself, well, the other way of looking at this is who are the very good players who have low batting average in the fourth innings, right? And you start going through and you're just like, oh my God, there's tons. And I actually had to lower the amount of runs because there were some players who were really... I think we started, me and Cheyenne started looking at like 500 runs or something. And I suddenly realized that there were players who weren't even on our list because they averaged like 20 in the fourth innings. They hadn't even made 500 runs. They batted there a lot of times. They just hadn't made any runs. So I think Trescothick was one that came up. And there was a few others.
Steve Waugh?
Yeah, Steve Waugh was... So he was a perfectly respectable player for the first two innings of the game and then really ordinary. He actually averaged less in the third and fourth innings than Smith did. So I was just doing all this manually just because... I don't have a system that helps me look at this particularly well automated. So I was going through it. But in the end, I was like, Alan Border and Michael Clark and, is it Colin McDonald? I think.
Yeah, it is Colin McDonald.
All these random Australian players. Even Usman Khawaja was really bad in the fourth innings. And you start going through it and you're like, this is weird. And it's weird how often it happened to Australian players, which might actually, I didn't write about it in the piece, but might actually, if you think about it, make sense. Because Australian players like consistent bounce. And the time you're going to get the least amount of consistent bounce is the fourth innings. So maybe that makes more sense. I don't know. But either way, we saw a lot of players who either had that sort of slide, even if it wasn't as stark a slide as Steve Smith was. And then you had a lot of players who were really good in the first couple of innings and then just drop off for the last couple of innings.
Yeah, no, Steve Smith's slide is the one in which you have like an age restriction. You can be this tall to ride this slide, otherwise don't ride that slide. Very dangerous. Yeah, it's the sort of slide that you go off and you're not sure you're going to touch the slide for the first little bit. And so now I've got all these different players. So I know that, but this is the first thing I wanted to know. Well, this can't just be sleep, right? You can't. I've never heard anyone ever talk about Steve Smith struggling to sleep throughout a test match. I've never heard of any of these other players. You're talking about players who are good against spin, players who are good against pace, tall players, short players, Asian players, non-Asian. There was no pattern, right? So straight away I start to think, I don't think this is about sleep, and also I don't think there's a specific reason. I think some players just struggle more at the end for a variety of different reasons. But then to go back to your wicket keeping point, I knew that wicket keepers had a starker curve than non-wicket keepers. But when I looked it up, it was exactly the same as batters, and I was like, I've looked this up before. I know wicket keepers are terrible in the last fourth innings. And then I thought, I would have looked up wicket keepers batting in the top 7. And so the best way of pointing it out is that both of them have a very similar curve for the first 3 innings. And then, but wicketkeepers who bat in the top 7 average about 10 or 15 more, right? Like it's a big difference. And then in the fourth innings, they almost average the same. So the more tired you get as a wicketkeeper who is putting in a lot of hard yards with a bat, it definitely affects your batting in the fourth innings. Because how can we say that all these wicketkeepers are better for 3 innings and then they get to the fourth innings and they're absolutely exhausted, right? There has to be that they are doing so much more work than a wicketkeeper batter is. So if you're a batter wicketkeeper, you're exhausted. Right. That was the point at which I happened to notice just after I did the wicketkeeping thing. And I was like, okay, tiredness does matter, right? That's interesting because I wouldn't have come into this thinking that tiredness had mattered as much. And then I was looking at, and remember when I said I had to lower the amount from 500 to whatever it was, 350 runs to get more player? That's when Ian Botham came up. Yeah.
And it was
we'll
like...
get to beefy though.
Hey?
I don't want to waste that just yet. Save that.
You want me to say beefy?
For next question.
So the point at this stage was that I think through the wicketkeepers, I proved that the tiredness was there. You're right that it isn't a similar pattern to Steve Smith, but what I would say is, remember, that's the overall average. That's always going to look more normal because it takes in every single player ever. I am sure that if I went through a bunch of wicket-keeping batters specifically, I would actually see a couple that were a little bit more like Steve Smith in that they probably average, between 40 and 60 in the first innings, and they probably average under 20 or under 30 in the fourth innings. I think you'd see that a lot more in that, because that is what the overall trend of that is, that metric is for wicket-keeper batters in the top 7.
Yeah, and if you're doing wicketkeeper research, here's a fun one for you. I know this is completely off topic and on a tangent, but there was this wicketkeeper for Pakistan, the late Taslim Arif, played 5 tests in 1980, scored over 500 runs as opener. Sorry, played 6 tests, kept wicket in 5, scored over 500 runs at 66 or over 66 as opener, and he never played a test again. And he also had a double 100 versus Australia and 250s.
He must have been really tired after all that, though. Maybe that was it. He's so exhausted they could never pick him again.
But there's a fun one for you. Another peculiar sort of finding of yours in your research, and I'll get to Beefy after this, I know you want to talk about that, was Bruce Mitchell, the South African cricketer who played his cricket before and after World War II, 42 tests, which were across 22 years. So this was, his trend per innings is a mirror image of Steve Smith. How weird is that?
Yeah. He's the best fourth innings batter we probably ever had.
Yeah.
And
so if Steve Smith is this, guys, Bruce Mitchell is this.
Yeah.
Just for context.
Yeah, one's the slide going down and the other one's the ladder going up, I suppose. But, the interesting thing about Mitchell was that my first thing was, this is all not outs. I can't take this seriously. And so then I just went back and I looked at the amount of runs he did and just took out his not outs, and he still averaged over 50 in the fourth innings. It's a small sample size, so I wouldn't be willing to sit here and say he's the greatest fourth innings player of all time. He didn't play in Asia because South Africans didn't play the Asians because they weren't white. So that is a different part of it. But there is absolutely no doubt, looking at it, that he got better as the match went on, in a way that is just... He was far more unnatural. What Steve Smith did was a lot more natural. I didn't really see any other Bruce Mitchells, right, that seemed to get better as the game went on. Bruce Mitchell was a fantastic player, and... There's many different reasons. South African cricket wasn't very big in the 1930s. They were broke. They weren't, other teams were coming through that were better at that point. They couldn't always afford to play their own first-class competition in the 20s and 30s. They weren't winning a lot of games. They weren't making... it was probably towards the end of the 1930s, partly because of him and some of the other players that they had coming through, that they started to become a slightly bigger deal. But he wasn't a flashy player. He wasn't sexy. No one ever talked him up. But he averages, 48 or 49, as you said.
49.
49, yeah. Over 22 years, in 42 matches, either side of the war. And Australia and England were the two best teams he had to go up against. He struggled a little bit with Australia, but he destroyed England in an era where England had so many good bowlers, and he would have been bowling on uncovered wickets in England, and he would have been playing in South Africa. Remember, he probably would have been playing on matting wickets at times. So for him to go to England and dominate shows you how good a player he was. And we don't know how good a fourth innings player he was, because I would say that I'm the first person to ever notice this. I mean, maybe I'm not. Maybe someone has written a book about Bruce Mitchell before. Or I know Gideon Haig's a big fan. Maybe he noticed it. But I've read a lot about Bruce Mitchell, and I'd never heard this fact before. And I think that was, to bring it back to Steve Smith, that was the thing of, you see this a lot. People go, look at his average in the first, second, third, and fourth innings. It must be because he's tired, blah, blah, blah. No one ever goes back to look to see if anyone else has ever done this before, right? And so when you look at this, you go, there's all sorts of weird patterns in some of these players, right? Players who average like 15 in the second innings. Like, well, what does that mean? Yeah. It doesn't make any sense. And so I think that, in showing Bruce Mitchell, what I really wanted to show was that we don't know that much about this, because this is a relatively new way of looking at cricket. Before that, we might have looked at players' averages first innings compared to second innings. Even then, if you go back and read old cricket books, these things aren't mentioned. It was hard to work it out. And before Stats Guru, it wasn't a big thing. And because of that, we hadn't really updated the way we talked about players. But clearly, there are players who specialize in different parts of the game, and we hadn't been noticing it as much as we should have.
Yeah, no, definitely Bruce Mitchell would make an interesting case study. But the case study that we're just about to talk about right now is, of course, Beefy Botham. Now, I love the little tangent that you went on with respect to the piece, because he didn't have a sleeping problem, but he was a hardcore party boy. Now, Beefy Botham, it's well documented that, he liked a night out. Even his autobiography, it has "Don't Tell Kath," underneath. Kath is his wife, or whoever does not know. So this is someone who went hard at it and, drank a lot and whatever. And if you look at his numbers, of course, he was also an all-rounder, so you have both his bowling and batting trends.
Yeah.
The batting trend is fairly similar to Steve Smith. There is a drop, but not quite as drastic, and there is a bit of a jump in the third innings as well. So a safer slide for kids.
Yeah, I think he's got a nice first innings, second and third are mediocre, and then the fourth is the one that drops off the cliff, isn't it?
Yeah, but what's more interesting is his bowling numbers. If you look at those, first three innings, it's fairly consistent, pretty much the same. There's not a lot of, what's the word over here? Variance in them. But when you look at the fourth innings, he completely skyrockets his average. And you can tell that, Beefy's had enough. He can't bowl anymore in this test match. So do you think that partying cost Ian Botham more or sleep cost Steve Smith more?
Well, I don't know how much you know about Botham, but so in the 80s, early 80s, it's basically him and Margaret Thatcher, right? They're the two most famous people. Cricket at that stage is massive in England. It's probably not bigger than football, but it's on the same level. And you only have 11 famous cricketers, right? Whereas you have a lot more famous footballers. And so he's the dude. He sort of takes over, after George Best, I suppose. He becomes, one of the most famous athletes in the country. Daley Thompson is around as well. So, there's a few others. But both of them is absolutely huge at that time. And the first, I want to say 18, maybe it might be 25 tests of his career. He's probably almost as good as the first 18 to 25 tests of anyone ever. Right? No one has ever started like Botham. Now, he didn't play West Indies maybe at all, or certainly very much in that period. So the best team he was supposed to go up against, he didn't. Remember, this is also World Series cricket period, so some of those teams are weakened. But we can't take away what he did because he was absolutely fantastic. And we know how good a cricketer he was. Then he becomes the most famous person in Britain. And he's never that cricketer again. He goes from being... You're talking about a guy who was such a great athlete that he played two sports professionally, right? And he goes from that to fat. You can argue everything you want. He's overweight for the back part of his career. He's certainly not as fit as he was. He's, big smoker. He's a big drinker. He's big with other illegal substances occasionally that you could, certainly allegedly. Actually, no, don't even think it is allegedly, is it? I think he was actually caught with some drugs at times. And so you have this athlete who is clearly not taking care of himself. We know what he did during games. There's all these incredible stories of like the team putting curfews on him, and the next morning the captain waking up to see a photo of both them out at 3 a.m. with a girl on each arm with a cigarette in his mouth, and all these sorts of things. Now, the one thing I would say is, I did look up another player that's not in the piece just because it didn't quite fit this, but I'll tell you why. I was saving this for you in the podcast, in fact, which is that Sobers also spent all night out, right? Okay. And Sobers' record doesn't change. I can't remember what his record is in the fourth innings with the ball, but I looked at his batting record in the fourth innings and it was absolutely fine. One thing I would say is that Sobers, for all of his lifestyle, still managed to be the best athlete that cricket had ever had by a big distance, whereas Botham's athletic gifts certainly go on the wane once he's not looking after his body and his life anymore.
Also, I want to point out the irony that his name is Sobers. I can't get past that.
The other thing I would say is that it's a bit like, have you seen The Last Dance?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you watch Michael Jordan, most of the film, he's got, a tequila or a bourbon in his hand, and he's smoking cigars, and he's still absolutely smoking everyone on the court. There are certain athletes who can manage that lifestyle, and it's just so much better than everyone else physically that it doesn't matter. Sobers was clearly in the Jordan capability, and Botham just wasn't. It did affect him. And people said to me, but a lot of the test matches he played were were 6 days, and there was a rest day. And I was like, yeah, but he probably spent that rest day partying harder, right? Like he had more time to party. So based on the wicket keepers and Botham, I'm pretty confident in the fact that from this perspective, what actually was happening here is that Botham had tired himself out, and that wicket keepers about in the top 7 certainly tire themselves out. and that Steve Smith is not sleepy as much, and there should be an impact on it. I don't think that takes away from the fact that I do think context matters for him. I do think playing across the line and the consistency of the bounce, all those things matter more to him than they would to other players. But I think once I saw Botham and I saw the wicket keepers, and we know what we know about Smith, I think it certainly plays a large part. Whether it's the largest part, we don't know. But there is no doubt that not sleeping during a test match, surprise, surprise, probably means that you're going to struggle more towards the end of the game than a normal player who is looking after themselves and can sleep.
Yep, that checks out, makes sense. And if you are a professional athlete, whoever's watching, get your sleep, drink responsibly, don't party too hard, and yeah, focus on the sport, I suppose. And, you know, it was fun recording this. Of course, I've come up with the title, Smudger Can't Snooze. I'm really proud of that. So anyway, thanks to everyone for tuning in. Thank you, Jarrod, for your time. And we'll catch you soon enough once again next week for episode 10 of FootMarks. That's all for now. Goodbye.
Perfect.
Yeah.